Welcome to a special broadcast here, and you are going to love this program. Our topic today is the ancient nation of Israel. We're going to discuss the origins of ancient Israel, the lost Israel empire, and the whereabouts of Israel's tribes today. We're also going to briefly touch on Bible prophecy. This is going to be the first of a series of interviews that I'm going to do with this guest. This is his first time on True News. I've only had a brief conversation with him, and I can tell you already that I believe he and I are on the same wavelength about our interpretation of Scripture and the identity of Israel and Bible prophecy and where America is found in the Bible. Steve Collins, welcome to True News.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Rick. Glad to be with you.
Well, I came across the news article about you, and that's how I first learned about your work. And we contacted you. You sent me a set of the books, and I got to tell you, I was like, this was Christmas to me. Thank you so much. These books are awesome. And you have done an enormous amount of research. This is very well written, very well researched. You've been doing this a number of years. You have 4 books out now. When did you start at what point in your life, when did you become a serious student of ancient Israel?
Well, I really began the serious research into this series of books in the late 1980s. I wrote an original book called The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel Found, which is now out of print. The 4 books whose titles you gave are the derivative books, that is the set that has greatly expanded the material and the visual offerings far beyond what was in the first book. The 4 books that you mentioned have photographs of ancient Hebrew artifacts that are found that were found in ancient America and are in museums. They have many illustrations, copious endnotes in a bibliography, indexes. So anyone can go into those books and duplicate the research and look for the same sources and see that what I'm saying is true.
All right, now the topic of Israel is one of the most talked about topics in the Western churches in America and Western Europe. It is also one of the most controversial topics. You can get a good food fight going very quickly talking about Israel. Is there a lot, in your opinion, of misconception and misunderstanding about Israel in the church today?
Very broad misconception. In fact, it's so deep and pervasive that it would completely revitalize Christianity and, frankly, give it an immense amount of renewed faith and vigor if they understood what the term Israel really means in terms of the Bible in the latter days. Maybe I could just give a brief description of that.
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. Let's just start at, where do we find the origin of Israel in the Bible? Where does it first appear?
Yes, I'll give where it first appears and then just give a little bit brief answer to your first part there on the misconceptions in modern Christianity. Because the term Israel really began under the United Kingdom of Israel that's formed under Saul, David, Solomon, briefly Rehoboam, and then it split. Then the tribes of Israel split into 2 separate Hebrew kingdoms. There was a southern kingdom called Judah, which eventually gave its name to the Jews. There was the northern 10 tribes of Israel, which was a much bigger kingdom, had many more tribes in it, and they were called Israel. So right at the beginning in ancient history, the term Israel applied to the 10 tribes of Israel, or the house of Israel it's called. The term Jew or Judah belonged on the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and largely the priestly tribe of Levi in the south. And when they went into exile and into captivity, and that's an interesting part of my book, only about a third of them went into captivity, and the Bible never mentions any more than about a third of them going into captivity. The rest voluntarily left their old home sites for founding new kingdoms and empires. However, the term in prophecy follows both of them, and I'll mention scriptures, and I might as well mention them now, in Jeremiah 51:5 and in Jeremiah 3:12. This is about a century after Israel has fallen and all the 10 tribes have gone into captivity or exile. In Jeremiah 3, he uses Jeremiah to send a prophecy to the 10 tribes of Israel even after their exile. And it shows clearly that God is still working with them, still watching where they went. And in Jeremiah 51, he says categorically, Israel has not been forsaken, nor Judah of the Lord of hosts. And he addresses them as different entities. Because at that particular time, Judah still had a kingdom. Israel was all scattered elsewhere. But these terms in the biblical perspectives, we have to remember all through history and up to our modern time, when we see that term Israel in prophecy, it's talking about the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. When it uses the term Judah in latter-day prophecies, it's talking about the Jews and the Jewish nation in the Mideast that was founded in 1948 and continues to today. Examples of that use of Judah are in Zephaniah 2, where it was prophesied that Judah would form a nation in the latter days in the old promised land. And that was fulfilled when the Jews formed the nation called Israel. Now, the term Israel applied to the Jewish state in 1948 has led to a massive confusion in modern Christianity. Newsweek magazine did a story here a couple of years ago that when the Jewish state was formed, because Truman was a big backer of it at the UN and recognized it very quickly, Truman was amazed that they didn't call themselves Judah or Judea, because he said, they're not Israel, they're Judah. Why did they call themselves a people that they're not? Truman was sophisticated enough biblically to realize Israel and Judah were not synonyms. They applied to different nations, different peoples. But the Jews named their modern nation after Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, rather than who they were as a people, Judah. Now, if they had named their kingdom or their modern nation Judah, think of the different situation we'd be in, Rick, today, because people would look on a modern globe and there wouldn't be any nation named Israel. So Christians would have to do research to find out, what nation or nations is God referring to in the modern world by the term Israel. We'd have to do some research biblically and in secular history to sleuth that out. But modern Christianity has made the mistake that Israel and Judah mean the same, one and the same, because the Jewish nation is named Israel, when in fact prophecies about Israel, such as in Ezekiel 38 and in other places, don't mean the Jews at all. It means the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. I hope that gives a brief
Yes, it does.
thumbnail sketch into the difference here, but Christianity, if it realized that the terms Israel and Judah are not synonyms, they're very different terms. In fact, in the Old Testament, you can see examples where the Israelites were at war with the Jews, like in 2 Kings 16:6, because the difference is, that's back when they had two separate kingdoms. But the term Israel and Judah has to be understood for what they are in the modern world. And once that clarification is made, it lights up the Bible and makes it relevant to modern world events like nobody previously imagined.
Okay, now in Genesis, God made a covenant with Abraham.
Correct.
And he promised to make him the father of many nations. Now, take us from that point and lead us through history and show us how these people who came out of Abraham then moved throughout the world and literally became the ones who created nations throughout the world.
Okay. But the Abrahamic covenant included, as what you mentioned, that Abraham would be the father of many nations and dynasties of kings. That's in Genesis 17. His descendants would be extremely numerous. They'd be like the stars of the heavens, sand of the sea. They would possess the gates of their enemies. And those blessings were passed down then from Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob. Jacob was then named Israel. And in Genesis 48 and 49, your readers can go back in those chapters and research them later. But in Genesis 48, the main portion of Abraham's blessings, called the birthright, were given to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Those were the sons of Joseph. And those tribes were blessed with the primary blessings of the largest nations possessing the gates of their enemies, that they would have the name of Isaac placed on them. That's in Genesis 21:12, that the name of Isaac would be placed on the birthright seed of Abraham, and that went to primarily the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, I'll save that for later in the interview for how that got fulfilled in our latter days. But then in Genesis 49, Jacob called in the rest of his sons, and he gave prophecies about each one of them, and he gave us clues about which tribes would be identified by various characteristics or traits or aspects of their history that would link to modern nations. So really the credibility of the Bible is at stake here. Either God kept his word or he didn't. And in Isaiah 41, God challenges people in verses 21 to 26 to look at his ability to fulfill his prophecies about the future as proof that the Bible is his word and that he's the sovereign of the universe. And when we can see that he has fulfilled all of his promises to Abraham, and he's fulfilling his prophecies about the tribes of Israel right up through history and up into our modern day today, we can see that God really is acting out an overall framework of a script for his plan for the nations that's being fulfilled perfectly in the world today, and you can see his hand is moving the nations. But when the Israelites, they formed a kingdom, and I'm going to skip ahead to when they passed the time of the judges, when they had a united kingdom under David and Solomon. During David and Solomon's period, they allied themselves to King Hiram, who was the king of, he really spoke for Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and what we are later called Phoenician cities. Although the Greeks wrote a great deal about the Phoenician Empire that was very great from like 1100 to 700 BC, which coincidentally is during the time of the Kingdom of Israel, living in the Mideast. After that period, Phoenicia reverted to a third-rate power. But the Greek historians record that the term Phoenicia, as they used it in their histories, meant the entire region from Asia Minor, that's Turkey, down through Lebanon, Israel, Judah, really to the border of Egypt. Everything on the eastern Mediterranean, all of that was called Phoenicia. So that term in the ancient world included the Israelite kingdoms. And Phoenicia was a great power. It was the number one maritime naval power on earth during the time that we read about it in the Bible. And it talks about the Phoenicians sharing the secrets of the sea and the maritime skills with the Israelites. They had a common navy that went everywhere in the world. The Bible talks about Solomon having a fleet of ships that would only return every 3 years with cargoes of animals from other continents. So these were globe-girdling powers. And in fact, in my books, you'll see documentation that the Phoenicians and Hebrews were here in ancient North America in a considerable amount of power in exploration strength. I've been at a particular tablet in Las Lunas, New Mexico region, where it has the Ten Commandments in ancient Paleo-Hebrew, and that's important because that's the language as it was spoken and written during the time of Solomon and David, where they were exploring the entire earth. And also, Solomon's first wife was a daughter of Pharaoh, so Egypt was an ally of the Phoenician Empire of David and Solomon at that time too. So their navies and power was also allied to them. They were a superpower in the ancient world, and the Bible mentions in the Chronicles that at one point when David's army reached the Euphrates River, and at that point the dominant power in the Mesopotamian world was the empire of Assyria. So David was knocking on Assyria's doorstep with his army. And the Bible in I think it's 1 Chronicles 18:19 in that area, it talks about how the kings of Mesopotamia with the Syrians provoked a war with David. They intended to wipe out David, and they came to watch the battle. They were so overconfident of victory, but David's army won and defeated the combined armies of the Mesopotamian kings, which would have included Assyria. And in his Psalms, he writes about things that happened in his life, and Psalm 83 is one of those Psalms where it describes this very war, where it says Asher is among them, and it names their allies, the Assyrians. Now, secular history records that during about a century after that battle occurred, Assyria became a weak backwater. It was an occupied nation, and it had been invaded by Semitic tribes from the west. Well, those were King David's forces. And so Solomon, when he became king after David's death, was really ruling over a global empire that explored the world. It talks about the kings of the earth from everywhere came to seek his wisdom. And it really was an incredible time of peace and scientific knowledge and pursuits for most of the time till Solomon later went bad and forsook God. But there's a number of artifacts that have been found here in the United States, ancient United States, and other places around the world that are remnants of this empire having spread around the world. Now, to jump ahead to where the Israelites left after their periods of exile, and my book includes a great deal about their wars with Assyria, their world explorations, and so forth. But at the time of their exiles, about a third of the Israelites went into captivity to either Assyria or Babylon. It mentions the tribes of Naphtali, the Gilead tribes of half of Manasseh, Reuben, Gad, Judah, and fractions of others. Some Ephraimites that would have been there in the siege of Samaria went into the cities of the Medes, it said. But there's about two-thirds of the nation that isn't accounted for in either the Bible or Assyrian records as ever having gone into captivity. And put ourselves in their positions. During the Phoenician Empire period, they had a system of colonies all over the world. Ancient Spain was called Iberia. That was after the name of Eber, the father of the Hebrews. The British Isles were called Britain even back then. Brit is the Hebrew word for covenant, so the covenant people's name was on that. They had also founded a colony called Carthage. We call it Carthage because we get our history from Rome. They called it Kiriathinians, or Kiryat Hadashah. Their language was Hebrew. Their leaders were the Shofetim. Their sacrifices originally were the same as that of the house of Israel. And Jewish sources record that the first kings of Carthage were the relatives of King Ahab and Jezebel. And, of course, during that time there was a terrible drought that was caused by the prayer of Elijah, and Israel had to export a lot of its population to its overseas colonies in order to keep them alive because there was a 3.5-year drought at that time. And Carthage was built up into a great deal of power at that time because they were fairly close in North Africa and the ships could sail. But when Assyria was invading Israel over and over again, it became clear the nation was no longer tenable, and the prophets were warning it was going to fall. Many of the people left and just simply booked passage on ships with their possessions and went to either Spain, Britain, Carthage, or many of them went overland. Jewish sources also record that a mass of perhaps up to 2 million people migrated overland and went up by the Black Sea. And this is also mentioned in the apocryphal book of 2nd Esdras, where it says God actually opened the Euphrates River at one point to allow them to escape the Assyrians and go up and preserve their independence up by the Black Sea. Well, as the generations went by, the Israelites consolidated their strengths in their new homelands and formed empires of their own. Now, Isaiah 14:2 is a prophecy that is rarely looked at or grasped by Christians. It says there that when the Israelites were to go into captivity, they would eventually end up ruling over the empires that took them captive. And that actually happened and is well documented in my book. Also in Hosea 1 is a key critical prophecy where God is pronouncing through Hosea that because of their sins, the Israelites were going to be exiled and expelled from the Promised Land. But in verse 10, he also says, oh, by the way, I'm going to really bless you with incredible large populations as you go into your new lands of exile. So he wasn't cutting them off to have them die out. He was sending them to new locations with much bigger territory where their populations could be expanded vastly larger than they ever were in Israel. And so we read over that we have to look for the nations of Israel among the large nations, kingdoms, and empires of the world, not among little knots of people here and there. And to just briefly mention some of where their empires went, I mentioned Carthage earlier. Carthage has its Hebrew origins were very well documented by the secular historians, and Carthage dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, and then we really only hear about them in the Punic Wars with Rome because we get the records from the Roman histories. Even during the Punic Wars, Carthage almost destroyed Rome. If you remember, Hannibal marched his battle elephants across the Alps into Italy and destroyed Roman army after Roman army. And at one point, all he had to do was march into Rome and take the city, and there wouldn't have been a Roman Empire. And he dithered and just couldn't give the order, allowing time for another Roman army to march in there and save the city. But I really see God's hand in keeping Hannibal, who was an Israelite general from the colony of Kiryat Hadashah, what we call Carthage, from doing that, because God always keeps his prophecies. And in Daniel's vision of the great image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, Rome was the legs of iron, split into an eastern and western empire, like the body splits into two legs at the torso. And if Carthage had defeated Rome, there would never have been a Roman Empire to fulfill God's prophecies, and his word would have failed. So he really kept an Israelite army from destroying Rome in order to fulfill his prophecies about Rome. Carthage eventually fell. They had tremendous contacts with the Mayans, in New World civilizations because they inherited all the Phoenician routes around the world. We have a myth that the ancient Greeks and Romans were the only civilized people. Well, we've been reading their propaganda. There were very many civilized people that they conquered or were never conquered by them. And the Phoenicians and Carthaginians had an excellent disinformation campaign. First off, they both controlled Gibraltar, which was a gate of the enemy, which was a promise that the Israelite people would have, key choke points. And the Greeks and Romans were land empires, and because Phoenicia and Carthage for 1,000 years controlled Gibraltar, Greece and Rome were never allowed out into the Atlantic. They learned about what Carthage found. Aristotle and other Greek historians wrote that the Carthaginians had found a secret land many days' sail west across the Atlantic that had mountains, arable soil, navigable rivers, a very pleasant land, and that has to be North America. And it's also confirmed by the fact that Carthaginian inscriptions and coins have been found in ancient North America, and even a spear-throwing atlatl with a Carthaginian inscription was found on it in the state of Georgia. So the Carthaginians had a great deal of contacts with the ancient Mayans and New World civilizations, and I write about that in my books. Now, another Israelite empire that formed was Scythia, up in the Black Sea. Those were the ones that went up there and became independent. Not too long after Israel fell with Samaria, about a century later, they gathered their strength, and they came down and destroyed the Assyrian Empire once and for all. And so the final battle between Assyria and Israel was won decisively by Israel. The Israelite Scythians flooded through the whole Middle East area, and they marched down through Syria, Lebanon, all the way to the borders of Egypt, and Egypt gave them tribute money to not invade them. But these Scythians treated the Jews in Judea, in the kingdom of Judah, which was still there, with great friendship. They didn't harm them at all. Why? Well, the reason is they recognized them as their brother tribes. And this was during the time of King Josiah. Biblical skeptics look at something and they say, well, the Bible conflicts itself. It can't be true. But they don't do their scholarship deep enough. You know, it says in one of the books of Kings that God had removed all of Israel and only the tribe of Judah was left. However, during the reign of Josiah, it clearly states that the Passover and some of the biblical holy days were being kept, and Josiah invited people from Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, the remnant of Israel that was living in their old cities at that time. And the reason is that was the time when the Scythians had invaded and were present all through the Middle East and in the old promised land of Israel.
So, Stephen, you're saying that these historical ancient kingdoms that we can read about in world history books, you're saying that these kingdoms were founded by Israelites.
That is correct. And what you will also find out is that the kingdoms and empires that were founded out by the Israelites are almost totally deleted and censored out of our modern history textbooks, because if you scratch them very deeply in their history, you can't help but see their Israelite names, their Israelite culture, their Israelite language, or Hebrew language.
Who's scratching it out?
Well, we have this politically correct evolutionary perspective that's permeated modern academia and the education system of the world, and that has eliminated the Israelite aspects from the history text.
Because are you saying that the eggheads in academia, if they know that if the people can trace these kingdoms back to ancient Israel, it validates the Bible?
Absolutely, it would validate the Bible, and it would also show God's hand is involved in directing the courses and destinies of nations, and it would show that we're very close to the end of this latter-day period and the return of Christ. And so this, it says in Revelation 12:9 that Satan will have succeeded in deceiving all the nations in the latter days. One of those deception abilities of his is to obscure the kingdoms of Israel. Let me give you an example of how altered our perception of the ancient world is. For example, if 2,000 years from now they were digging up the history of this 20th century world after, say, a nuclear war and rebuilding society after Dark Ages, if they discovered the ancient records of Rome, in Moscow, and they read about the United States from the standpoint of Russian propaganda and didn't have any of our records and didn't talk about it, If they only talked about our period of the 20th century from the standpoint of Russia being the great civilized power and the United States being barbarians, they would have a totally warped view of history. We have that totally warped view of history because Rome was the ancient barbarians that destroyed nations and kingdoms. They were the aggressive imperialists. They enjoyed blood sport, watching people kill each other in the millennium or in the Colosseum. They also their word was worthless. They broke all their treaties. Parthia, another kingdom that was a brother empire to Scythia that I have not yet talked about, they had a bicameral legislature, if you will, and they elected their kings. They gave great religious freedom, great liberty. They had a feudal system that was later transported into Europe when Parthia fell. It's getting a bit ahead of it, but until evolution came along in the late 1980s, the kingdom or empire of Parthia was greatly talked about. Many books were written by them. The Greeks and Romans wrote an immense amount of material about it because it was one of the greatest empires in the history of the earth. However, you can't even find it in most history books because it's been totally censored out. It's as bizarre as if Rome was not even mentioned in ancient history textbooks. But the Parthians were really the descendants of the tribes of Israel that did go into captivity and fulfilled the prophecy in Isaiah 14:2 that they would eventually end up ruling over the empires that had taken them captive. And that happened in about 250 BC when the Parthians revolted from the Seleucid Greeks, and they ended up ruling Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and all that was left of the Seleucid Greek kingdoms. And they ruled everything from the Euphrates River to India and from like the steppes of Russia to the Persian Gulf.
Now, yeah. Steve, I want to ask you this. We have a lot of, our listening audience is very diverse around the world. And now, one thing that I've discovered and I've come up against is that when you talk to Christians who describe themselves as Christian Zionists, they're very supportive of modern Israel, and I don't want to get into that discussion right now. But when you talk to them about the tribes of Israel, they automatically mistake what you're saying. They see it as that you're attacking the Jews. If you try to talk about the tribes of Israel, they automatically assume that you're anti-Jewish. How do we help the Christians who call themselves Christian Zionists? How do we help them see the historical background of Israel and God's people?
Sure. And in fact, I've encountered the exact same thing, so I know what you're talking about. And in fact, in trying to identify the tribes of the 10 tribes of Israel in the modern world, or where they were in history, we're not at all being anti-Jewish. In fact, what we're trying to do is put the family of Israel's tribes back together again, where they recognize each other and develop a oneness. And in fact, that's prophesied to eventually be inevitable. Because in Ezekiel 37, it talks about the prophecy of the two sticks, one for the tribes of Israel, one for the tribes of Judah, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That when the resurrection occurs and David is resurrected to be their king, obviously under Jesus Christ, King David will be a king over the reunited tribes of Israel, all 13 of them, really, with Manasseh included, in the beginning of the millennium. And Judah and Israel will be friends and brother tribes together at that time. Now, another thing is there are groups of people around the world that are seeing the same truth. I have a friend in Israel named Yair Davidi, who you may want to have as a guest someday. He's written a number of books from the standpoint, he's an Orthodox Jew. I've been in Israel. He's a friend of mine. I've spent a week going around Israel with him and other rabbis. And there's a number in Israel that completely agree with the concepts of my book that the 10 tribes of Israel are scattered through Europe and North America and other places in the world. They're trying to wake up the Jewish world to the fact that we're Israelites, their brother tribe, and they're also trying to help, as I am, to wake up the house of Israel to realize they are the house of Israel and that we are brother tribes.
That's right.
To the Jews.
I try to share with Christian Zionists. Look, what you're calling Israel in the Middle East today, we have one tribe that has come back. Where are the rest of the tribes? you're focusing all of your attention on one tribe. But where's everybody else?
Indeed, that's totally correct, because the prophecy in Zephaniah 2 says that it's the tribe of Judah, and only Judah, that would form a nation in the latter days, just before Christ comes, and that was fulfilled in 1948 when the Jews established a kingdom, or not a kingdom, but a modern nation of their own, and that's the first time the Jews had really had a nation of their own in a very, very long time in history. So that was not prophesied to really happen until the latter days. Judah is our brother tribe for the Israelite tribe. So what we're trying to do is put the tribes of Israel back together, recognize each other, and become natural allies in the world, which is what they should be. I'm very pro-Jewish, as my friends in the Israeli nation know. Mm-hmm. And also there is an unusual dynamic, even among the people that there is a group of called, for want of a better term, Messianic Jews or mm-hmm. Messianic believers. They're divided into two camps. There's the side that, as you referred to, does not want to hear about the 10 tribes of Israel. And then there's also the Messianic two-house movement or camp, which does want to find the 10 tribes and largely recognizes them. I've got many friends and have spoken to a number of their congregations around the country who are Messianic two-house rabbis, teachers, and leaders of congregations who have recognized where the 10 tribes of Israel are as a result of reading my books and other books that are extant in the Messianic community. So this truth is getting harder and harder to conceal, because more and more people around the world are seeing that you can find the 10 tribes of Israel, and it absolutely turns the world upside down in our modern world when you realize who they are and you look at the latter-day prophecies about Israel and Judah, realizing they're discussing different groups, and you see how powerfully these prophecies have been fulfilled.
All right, so you're saying that the political entity that we have in the Middle East that is known as Israel is this is a nation that has come together from the tribe of Judah. These are the Jews. This is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, but it is not Israel.
That is correct. And in fact, Zephaniah 2 doesn't even mention Israel as coming back into the land at that particular time. It only says Judah. And the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews both were used to fulfill those prophecies about Judah. They came together and formed that Jewish state in 1948. And they jointly together were branches of the house of Judah that were in their diaspora that came together in one nation in 1948, and they've been there ever since. And so really, Judah, the Jews, has a divine right to a land in the promised land, because Zephaniah 2 shows that God gave them that divine right, and he's not going to let that nation be extinguished. Just to show in Zechariah 12 and 14, these are other prophecies about Judah, and it's closely linking Judah and Jerusalem together in each of those prophecies. In Zechariah 14, it shows that while Judah is involved in a war and Jerusalem is half subdued at that time, that is the moment when the Messiah, we Christians know as Jesus Christ, returns and sets his feet on the Mount of Olives and rescues them. And then Zechariah 12 says Judah as a whole will recognize the Messiah as the one they have pierced when he comes as the conquering Messiah. And but Zechariah 12 also says that although all nations are gathered together against Judah and Jerusalem, God will be their protector and defender. So they're not going to be extinguished. You know, the mullahs of Iran and the other people that want to wipe out the Israelis are not going to succeed. God has guaranteed that the Israeli nation will survive right up to the time when the Messiah returns and sets up a millennial kingdom.
Well, Stephen, you're really settling a lot of things for me. I mean, I've had over these 11 years of broadcasting, this has been a topic that we have discussed, and I've known that what is being taught in mainstream evangelical Christianity in America is not right. It's like I just know in my spirit this isn't right. It's not lining up with the Word. But it's been very difficult to try to sort out what is the truth. Who is Israel? And what you're doing for me today, you're really helping me settle a lot of issues. I mean, I really feel peacefulness coming over me about some of these issues. And I think I know our listeners are getting the same the same benefit from this interview?
Well, they're only getting the very tips of the icebergs of the deep story that's here in the Israel, because I have documentation, not just from the Bible, but from a plethora of secular historical sources, that the Israelites became very powerful empires. For example, Josephus in the 1st century A.D. writes, as a contemporary in the 1st century A.D. with Christ and the Apostolic Church, he writes that the 10 tribes of Israel had become exceedingly numerous in the earth, and that they were located beyond Euphrates. Now, the Euphrates River at the time he wrote was the well-established border between the Roman and Parthian empires. So what he was saying is the 10 tribes were in Parthia. That would be understood as easily to the writers of his day as if we today were all in Texas and we were saying, well, we're going to go across the Rio Grande this weekend. We would understand that as a euphemism for in Mexico. Beyond the Euphrates was a euphemism for in Parthia. And Parthia was the source of the wise men and magi who came to visit the Christ child and brought the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The reason that the Bible says that Herod and the whole city of Jerusalem was scared to death when they arrived was because these were the magi and wise men were the ones who selected the emperors of Parthia. They were the nobility, and they traveled with many, many thousands of armed escorts. And this was at a time of peace between Rome and Parthia, so the Parthian soldiers that came with the magi would have outnumbered Rome's garrison. And Herod had to treat them with great deference because he was afraid that the Parthians would conquer Jerusalem, which they had done just a few decades before, and Parthia had ruled Jerusalem just a few decades before Jesus was born. And the Parthians were a powerful Israelite kingdom. You can see their Israelite origins in my book. Some of their cities had Israelite names. One was Samariana, preserving the name of Samaria, the old kingdom of Israel's capital. Another was Gaza, the old Philistine city. Another one was Asak, which was, when you move the vowel points a little bit, is the name of Isaac. And Genesis 21:12 says that the seed of Israel, the birthright seed, will be known by Isaac. The Parthian and the Scythian tribes up north in Russia were both called Sake or Saka. They were named after Yitzhak or Isaac, and they had the name of Isaac on them. Now might be a good time to segue into, with the time we have left today, to where some of the Israelite tribes are today.
Yeah. I was just thinking, though, as you were talking about the wise men and the magi, this explains why they came to find the Christ child.
And it also shows the God of Israel was working with the Parthian nobility and their priesthood to show them that the Messiah was due at that time, and they led. And it doesn't say in the Bible there was just 3. I think there was
That's
10
right.
or 12 of them, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they came visiting the Christ child to give him the wealth that he later used to finance his ministry. And Rome, it says in the Bible plainly, Pilate didn't want to kill Jesus and crucify him. He tried to keep him alive.
There's an altar in Iran that the wise men built on their way back.
Now you've got me there. I didn't even know about that. That's interesting information.
I came across that information. My son Jeremy is a Christian filmmaker, and he's been working on a movie about Noah's Ark, and so I was helping him in some research, and I came across that fact that there is an altar in modern day modern day Iran, that the wise men built on the way home. They built it to the Messiah that they had seen with their eyes.
Boy, that would be most interesting to have, and also they better get pictures of it soon, because the current rulers of Iran are so radically Shiite Muslim. They're destroying the history of Iran. They're destroying Parthian, Sasanian, and Achaemenid Persian artifacts, and so I don't know how much longer that'll last if they find out that it exists.
That's true. Stephen, we got about 9 minutes. This is going by so fast. As I said in the beginning, we're just going to scratch the surface of this, and I'm going to have Stephen back throughout 2011. We're going to go deeper and deeper into this subject. Let's talk about the Israelites today.
Okay, I'll just give the brief highlights. When Parthia fell in 250 B.C., after many huge wars with Rome, which Parthia usually won, their tribes were overthrown by the Persians, which was called the Sasanian Persians. They had to migrate because they had governed the area for 500 years. The Sasanian Persians went on a jihad, if I can use that term out of time, because they were Zoroastrians, not Muslims. But they went on a Zoroastrian jihad to kick all the Semitic peoples out of Asia. So the Parthians and all their allied peoples had to leave for their lives. They couldn't go. The only direction they could flee was to the northwest toward Armenia, because that was the one Parthian province that stayed free. And so anyway, all of the Parthians were attracted to that like a magnet. But there were so many millions of them migrating, they couldn't possibly stay in that mountainous Caucasus region and grow crops. They had to just pass through there into the Black Sea and Scythian area, and from there they staged their invasions of Europe. In Parthia, some of the constituent peoples were called the Kermans, or Germanii, the Sake, the Jats, and the Gothai. Now, when they went into Europe, they were called the Germans, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Goths. Their names were almost unchanged. Now, it's interesting in the modern historical textbooks when it talks about all of the invasions of the Germans, Saxons, Jutes, and Goths into Europe, it doesn't say where they came from. It never asks the question, where did these millions and millions and millions of Caucasians come out of Asia, and why were they coming into Europe at that time? Well, the reason was in the 3rd century A.D., Parthia collapsed, one of the greatest empires in history. It was a Caucasian empire. And that term Caucasian, by the way, developed later because these tribes migrated through the Caucasus Mountains. They were called Caucasoids or Caucasians because their tribes had migrated through Europe or through that area into Europe. Now, they spilled out into Europe, and over centuries, it took many centuries for them to get all of their peoples into Europe, and also they eventually inundated and destroyed the Roman Empire. They were not the barbarians that are pictured in the Roman propaganda. As my books point out, the Goths in particular, when they conquered Rome, they were Christians, and they gave sanctuary to anybody who took refuge in churches, and they were remarkably respectful, actually. Now, the Bible in Genesis 49, to leap ahead, gives prophecies about different tribes of Israel in the latter days. I'll go into just a few of them. We know where the Jews are. They're in the Middle East or scattered around the world. One particular tribe that is so clear, it shows God's hand in it, I want to be sure to give your listeners this. That's Zebulun. In Genesis 49:13, it prophesies the tribe of Zebulun in the latter days will include a great seaport, a haven of ships, it's called in the King James. So it has to be a seacoast nation. It's also going to be a land that is a haven of the sea. In other words, it's bought back or sheltered from the sea. So can you think of a European nation that has a system of dikes that has, salvaged much of its land from the sea and has a giant seaport? That's the Netherlands. Rotterdam is the #1 seaport in the world in gross tonnage, or at least it was until recent years, perhaps. Now China might have a larger one, but Netherlands is the seacoast city or the seacoast nation that has its land as a haven from the sea through its system of dikes. And the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh are the major tribes of the birthright ones that had the name of Isaac upon them. And now Isaac was given as Sake or Saka with a C or a K in Asia. The Romans turned that into an X, and they called these people the Saxons. So when the Saxons migrated and ended up mostly in the British Isles region, although many were still in Germany, Saxony is a term in Germany that has the same name as the Saxons that were in England. And English and German were cognate languages that came from the same root. But Ephraim and Manasseh were prophesied in Genesis 48 to become a single great nation, and that was Manasseh, and Ephraim was to be a company or multitude or group of nations. So you have to look for two nations that are brothers in the world, one with one big nation and another with a group of nations. The United States bears the name of Isaac upon it as a Saxon nation, Anglo-Saxon. It's the one single great nation. Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and their commonwealth became the multitude of nations that was ruled by Ephraim. And indeed, Ephraim is Great Britain. The British Isles have been known by a Hebrew name continuously for 3 millennia, since the time of Solomon. Britain is the Hebrew word, or Great Britain is the Hebrew word that includes the root word for covenant, Brit, or Berith. And so God has a Hebrew name stamped on Britain to this day. Interestingly, in the 1850s, a pastor named Pitts, whose message I cite in my books, he gave a message to a joint session of the U.S. Congress pointing out that the United States was Israel. that it was descended from the tribes of Israel, was regathered Israel over here, and so this knowledge has been known, but it's been suppressed and then extinguished by the evolutionists that took control of our academic textbooks. Another interesting fact about Manasseh is, in Genesis 48, Ephraim was the son that got the right hand of Jacob upon him, and that was ordinarily the sign of the greatest blessing. Joseph, the father of the two boys, was displeased and tried to move Manasseh's hand, or move Jacob's hand onto Manasseh's head, because Manasseh was the oldest, and Jacob said, no, it's going to be this way. But they would be growing in equally together into a multitude in the earth. So they were migrated together, and they still have a special relationship as they do in the Anglo-Saxon nations. But the number 13 applies to Manasseh, because Manasseh was grandfathered in, literally, by grandfather Jacob as a tribe of Israel along with all of the other tribes. So Joseph got a double portion, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh had the left hand on his head, so he was the one that was grandfathered in as the 13th tribe of Israel. And the number 13 is America's number. We started with 13 colonies. We start, with 13 stripes in our flag. Today, our national emblem, our great seal, has 13 all over it. There's 13 letters in E pluribus unum, 13 arrows in the one talon of the eagle, 13 berries, I think, and 13 olive branches or leaves. There's 13 red and white stripes in the great shield. But that number 13 was stamped on the founding of the United States to show that it was the 13th tribe of Israel, Manasseh.
Now, Steve, we're at the point where we have to close, and like I said, we're just scratching the surface of this topic. But I'm going to give you 1 minute to tell, just to whet the appetite for a future interview. Is the United States of America in Bible prophecy?
Yes, and I should mention that there's an article on my website, USA in Bible in Bible Prophecy. My website is www.stephenmcollins.com, and that's Stephen with a V. But you can read that to get the full extent of it, showing that the United States is most definitely mentioned in Bible prophecy, and I'll just give a brief little teaser. For example, many Christians know that Ezekiel 38 is a prophecy for the latter days, and they rightly see the Gog-Magog alliances, Russia, China, Iran, etc., and that we're living in the latter days. But they think they see in Ezekiel 38 that Israel is going to be attacked by that alliance, and so they assume it's the Jewish state in the Middle East. It isn't. If it was that nation, God would have used the term Judah, which isn't found anywhere in Ezekiel 38 and 39. He uses the term Israel because it's the 10 tribes of Israel that are going to be attacked by that alliance, which means that's the nations that are descended from the 10 tribes of Israel that moved into Europe and then founded the United States, Canada, Australia, and other nations from that point. So what we really have is Israel is actually describing the United States and British-led NATO alliance and their allies in the world. So it really pinpoints the West and the East alliances of this world. And it says there's going to be a great World War III between them in the very end time, which Christ himself warned in Matthew 24, that unless he came, there would be no flesh left alive. And I also have an article at my website saying what Ezekiel 38 and 39 reveal about a future World War III, which has a great deal of detail with Ezekiel 38 and 39 and related prophecies to just show what God says is going to happen in our future. So I urge your listeners to read that, because it's going to affect their lives and that of their families and their securities in the future.
This is a very serious program. We're talking about the souls and the lives of several 100 million people. And I am approaching this with great somberness and seriousness, understanding the gravity of the subject that we are discussing today. Because this is not just a theory. This is not just another Bible prophecy concept. No, this is life and death. And we are quickly approaching the hour that prophecy will be fulfilled. This is Ezekiel 38. And listen to it carefully, because my prayer is that you will hear things today that you didn't hear before. Now let's pray. Heavenly Father, we worship you and we praise you. We come to you, Father, in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and we ask you, Father, to bless this radio program and bless and anoint Stephen Collins, that he would bring forth truth and revelation. I pray, Father, for everyone listening, that their eyes and ears, hearts will be open for teaching and for receiving your holy word. Father, we praise you in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Ezekiel 38, now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against them, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around and put hooks into your jaws and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them having swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops. The house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many people are with you. Prepare yourself and be ready, you and all of your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops and many peoples with you. Thus says the Lord God, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates, to take plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, and against a people gathered from the nations who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land. Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take a plunder? Have you gathered your army to take a booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take a great plunder? Therefore, Son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, thus says the Lord God, on that day, when my people Israel dwell safely, will you not know it? Then you will come from your place out of the far north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me, when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. Thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them? And it will come to pass at the same time when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show in my face, for in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath I have spoken. Surely in that day there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea, the birds of the heaven, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that creep on the earth, and all men who are on the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, The mountains shall be thrown down, the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, says the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother, and I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. Mr. Stephen Collins, Bible scholar, researcher, historian, writer, is on the telephone with me right now. We're going to spend this entire program discussing in detail, in depth, who really is named in Ezekiel 38. Do the Bible prophecy teachers today, do they have it wrong? Are they misinterpreting the scriptures? If so, what are the consequences if they have misinterpreted this prophecy? The overwhelming majority of Bible prophecy teachers in America teach that the targeted nation in Ezekiel 38 is the Jewish state in the Middle East, that they will be attacked, the Jewish people will be attacked by Russia, and a group of allies will swoop down on Israel. And the common teaching is that Israel will discover oil, natural gas, which they have in just recent days,
yes, they have.
a substantial amount, and that they will come to take a spoil, and that this will be a great war, that God will intervene, fight on behalf of Israel, and crush Russia and her allies in this war. Is that what you believe?
Well, there's three elements to the Ezekiel 38 and I should say 39 prophecy because they go together. The modern Christian world and most prophetic teachers have two of those three elements right. This is clearly talking about a great world war in the latter days just before Christ comes, and there's the attacking alliance. There are the people called Israel who are attacked, and there's the time context, which is clearly stated as the latter days. And most Christian teachers have the latter days down solid. They know it's here in the latter days before Christ comes. And virtually all of them also identify the alliance of that's coming under Russia, which is Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and their allies as the Gog-Magog alliance. It's the target nation of Israel that throws people off and gets them confused, and this is where the rubber really meets the road. And, we in the United States have watched so many wars on CNN and Fox News. We can comfortably eat meals and watch, munch popcorn as we watch the rest of the world go through suffering. When the Iraqi war, the first one, Persian Gulf War, and the second one took place, we watched it live on Fox News and CNN. When Saddam Hussein's missiles were raining on Israel, we watched it on cable TV in the comforts of our living room undeterred, from any pursuits we might have had. But I ask your listeners to consider, Christ prophesied in Matthew 24 that unless he were to intervene in the latter days and return, there would be no flesh left alive on the planet. This is a global world war. No flesh left alive means all Americans, Canadians, Europeans, Australians, etc. There wouldn't be anybody left alive. So everybody's going to be involved in this great end-time war. No nation is going to be sitting on the sidelines cheering one group on or sitting from some protected position. So I'd really like to focus on who Israel is, because that's the target nation to show how relevant the Bible really is to the modern world.
So in order to properly discern and understand Ezekiel 38, you must first understand and know who is Israel.
That is absolutely correct. It's a total prerequisite. It's just like you go to a play. If you don't get a program that tells you who the characters and actors are, you're going to have a great deal of confusion in understanding the play. God gives us a script and a program here in Ezekiel 38 for the latter days, but we have made the mistake of seeing who the attacked entity is. Now, In Ezekiel 38 and 39, the group that is attacked is called Israel. It's called the people of Israel. It's called the land of Israel. And in 39, when the war is all done, it says the house of Israel will have to bury for 7 months the bodies of all the people that have fallen and slain in the land of where the house of Israel is. And the house of Israel consistently in the Bible means the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. It does not mean the Jews. As we mentioned in the first program that we did, there's a huge difference between Israel and Judah in biblical historical narratives and also in the prophecies. These are not synonyms. Israel and Judah were listed even as separate entities and separate people when they were temporarily united under King David and Solomon. They were still numbered in censuses as totally different groups. And when the Bible uses the term Judah in the latter days, then it's designating the Jewish state in the Middle East. It does so in Zephaniah 2, Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14. There it mentions Judah. Now, when it talks about the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel, it uses the term Israel, or the house of Israel. And as we mentioned in the first program, when the Jewish nation was formed in 1948 in the Mideast, they used the name Israel. And Newsweek magazine had done a story here a couple of years ago that President Harry Truman was very surprised that they called themselves Israel, because he said, they're not Israel. They're not the people called Israel. They're Judah. And he expected the Jews to call their country Judea or Judah, after who they really were. But they elected to call it after the name of the ancient land rather than who they were as a people prophetically and biblically. So the real issue is identifying Israel. And as we discussed last time, these people were not going to die out. In Hosea 1, when they went into exile, God promised they would become extremely more numerous after he sent them into exile than they ever were in the promised land. In Genesis 21:12, it states that the birthright descendants of Abraham will be named after the name of Isaac, that name will be stamped on them. James 1:1, it says in that New Testament book was addressed to the 12 tribes of Israel, scattered abroad. So in the apostolic area, they knew that these tribes were still on the earth and that they had addresses that they could send these epistles to. Now, to make a long story short, also Genesis 48 shows that when Jacob passed on this birthright promise, he gave it to the descendants of Joseph, who were the sons Ephraim and Manasseh. They each had so the tribe of Joseph got a double portion, and the 12 tribes of Israel became 13 when Joseph had 2 tribes. But that name of Isaac was stamped on the 2 brother tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, and that name of Isaac was stamped on them. Now, in ancient history in my books and also at my website, you'll see plenty of materials and articles documenting this, that they were called after Isaac or Isaac before they left the promised land. I have the scriptures cited in there. And when they migrated and exiled into Asia, that name of Isaac stayed upon them. They were called the Sake or the Saka. The Greeks used a C, S-A-C. The Persians were more like S-A-K. That's like a Yitzhak, more of an Aramaic pronunciation. The Romans called these same people Saxons. They gave them an X instead of a C or a K, and they rendered the name Saxon. And when the great empire of Parthia fell, which is the 3rd book in that sequence, that's the empire where the wise men and magi came to visit the Christ child. That was a huge Israelite empire in ancient Asia, which frequently knocked the stuffing out of the Roman Empire, something that is not discussed at all in our history books. But in Genesis 48, Jacob had a special prophecy that the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh in the latter days would become a nation and a company of nations. They'd be brother tribal nations. But Manasseh would be the single great nation, and Ephraim would be a grouping or company of nations. And you have to look for which are the Saxon nations in the world that are having the name of Isaac still stamped on them. The Anglo-Saxon nations are well known. The United States is a single great nation. The British Commonwealth is a group of nations. They're both Anglo-Saxon nations. They have inherited all of the promises of large population, wealth, victory in war, possessing strategic choke points, the gates of their enemies, natural resources. They have inherited all the promises of Abraham and fulfilled the prophecies for Ephraim and Manasseh. And that name of Isaac was to stay on them, and the name of Israel was to stay on them. That was promised in Genesis 48.
Now, Stephen, this explains how the British Isles, which as far as geographical territory is not very big. It explains how how Great Britain has had such enormous influence in the entire world. I mean, you look at a map and you go, Great Britain, it's just a small group of islands, and yet their influence is felt on all the continents of the world. It's because Great Britain was populated by the people of Israel.
Yeah, the Ephraim, the main tribe of the house of Israel. And the Anglo-Saxon people have inherited their blessings not because they're superior to others or better. It's because we have enjoyed the covenant blessings which God gave to Abraham and passed down to Isaac, Jacob, and then to Joseph and his children Ephraim and Manasseh. Our American nations and Anglo-Saxon nations and other European nations which are descended from the other tribes of Israel do not realize that we in the Western world have our blessings and benefits because of God's keeping his covenant promises to Abraham. And he's been faithful to those promises whether the Israelite nations knew who they were or not. And there were times in Britain where it was revived, like in the time of Queen Victoria. There were many, even in her government, that realized that the British were descended from the House of Israel. It's in the it's in the Declaration of Independence up in Scotland, in their founding document, that they were descended from the Scythians, the Sacae, the people who had the name of Isaac upon them from Asia. And even in the 1800s, there was a minister named Pitts who gave a series of sermons to the United States Congress, proving out of the scriptures that the United States was a regathered Zion or a regathered Israel, but it was the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel.
I've read those sermons, and they're amazing.
Yes, so this knowledge has been known in the past, but it was it's ever since evolution came on the scene and people were convinced that they all evolved from pond slime instead of being created by a divine creator. Our academic world and establishment has completely removed the Bible from public discourse in the colleges and the schools, and people have lost this knowledge. But God is working out his prophecies his way, whether people know who they are or not. And so it behooves us as believers to understand what God's terms are here. But now if I can just discuss the ramifications for our modern Western world here out of Ezekiel 38, this is really where it will dramatically affect the lives of everybody who's hearing this broadcast in the future.
Let's go for it, Steve, because, again, 99.9% of the evangelical Christians in this country, if you ask them what is going to happen when Ezekiel 38 is fulfilled, they're going to say Russia and her allies are going to swoop down on the Jewish people in the Middle East. There's going to be a great war, but God's going to rescue them and stop the war. It's not going to affect us.
Yeah, that is incorrect. They are correct, though, that God will intervene in this war and rescue his people. That is truthful. Mm-hmm. But he's going to rescue, in this particular case, he's discussing the world war as it pertains to Israel. In Zechariah 14, you can read how the world war will pan out as it pertains to Judah. But the Judah entity, the Jews, are not mentioned anywhere in Ezekiel 38 and 39. I mean, I encourage your listeners, get out a concordance. You can see this for yourself. Judah is nowhere discussed anywhere in this Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy. Only Israel, the 10 tribes.
Now, Stephen, just for clarification, because I don't want anybody emailing me and you and misinterpreting what you're saying. You're not someone who is teaching that the Jews today are irrelevant. It doesn't matter anything. God's written them off in their history.
Of course not. Absolutely not. No, God has neither forsaken Israel nor Judah, and in fact, it's quite obvious because he used the Jews to fulfill the latter-day prophecy in Zephaniah 2 that the Jews would have a nation of their own in the promised land in the latter days. So they have a divine right to be there as a nation, and he's clearly working with the Jews because that was one of the signal prophecies that would say that the latter-day time clock had started. And that started in 1948 when Judah was there. And so I'm not saying Judah is not going to be attacked. Zechariah 14 shows they will be attacked in the latter days at the same time as we are. However, just as World War II had many different theaters of combat, Zechariah 14 describes the war in the Mideast as it pertains to the Israeli region. Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes the war as it will befall the tribes of the house of Israel, which is the 10 tribes of Israel.
All right, so you're saying that the Jews in the Middle East, in the land known as Israel, which you said should be called Judah, but you're saying that they will be attacked at the same time Israel is attacked, the Israelites.
Of course, this is going to be a world war. Like Christ said, there wouldn't be any flesh left alive on the earth if he didn't intervene in this war. It's going to be all over the planet. And it says in Zechariah 14 that his feet stand on the Mount of Olives, and it says Judah will be rescued first by Christ when he returns. As they've got a very small homeland there, they'll be in the greatest danger. But Judah and Israel are both attacked simultaneously. This is also confirmable in Jeremiah 30, which is a latter-day prophecy where it says Judah and Israel will both be attacked, and they'll both be rescued in the latter days by the return of the Messiah. So in Ezekiel 38 here, just to show how this applies to the United States, and also I should mention on my website, on the homepage, there's an article called The U.S. in Bible Prophecy that goes into this in great depth, and your listeners can also access my article, What Ezekiel 38 and 39 Reveal About a Future World War III, because it'll have much more detail than I can give them the high points of today. But when you look at verse 8, it says that the mountains of Israel. Now, mountains can sometimes refer to actual physical mountains, or sometimes it can refer to the symbolic of nations, with large nations being mountains and small nations being referred to as hills. But in this particular case, I think it is physical mountains. But it says that this Gog-Magog alliance will come and attack a nation that is gathered out of many people. So in other words, it's going to attack a melting pot nation, isn't it? And verse 12 has the same theme. It says, upon the people that are gathered out of many nations. The United States was settled out of many nations when we were founded as 13 original colonies and then became a nation. And where it says the mountains of Israel, which have always waste, I'm reading from the King James. If you fly in an airplane over the Rocky Mountains, you can fly an awful long time without seeing any sign of civilization down there. But now, I've been to Israel, and for everybody of your listeners who have been to Israel, the mountains of Israel really aren't mountains like the Rockies. They're, in the hill country of Ephraim and so forth. They're very large hills, more than real mountains, and they've been built on by civilization over and over and over again.
Let me throw this out to you, Stephen. When Ezekiel 38 is referring to a land that is inhabited again, meaning to me that it had been inhabited earlier, is it possible that the Bible is referring to an ancient pre-flood civilization that was here before the Great Flood?
It's possible, but I think it's more likely that when people read my books or listen to some of the material in the first broadcast, under the time of David and Solomon, the Israelites were called the Phoenician Empire, but it was Israel that was the senior partner in that. The city-states of Tyre and Sidon had very small populations. Israel had a big population. And David and Solomon allied themselves with King Hiram and his worldwide maritime fleets. And they, as my book documents, they weren't just limited to sailing around the Mediterranean. They left their name in Britain. The covenant, in Hebrew, the word covenant is Berit. Britain, the British Isles have been known continuously by a Hebrew name for 3,000 years. The Bible says that they mined copper and iron in great abundance for the temple. And my book makes the case that the copper mines around Lake Michigan were mined to exhaustion by radiocarbon dating about 1000 BC. That's the time of King David, when he was massing copper from all over for the temple. And the nation of Brazil is to this day known by a Hebrew name. The Hebrew word for iron is barzel. Vowels weren't written in the ancient times, but the consonants were B-R-Z-L. Brazil, and they're still known for an iron ore exporting nation. So there's Hebrew names scattered around in artifacts. The Ten Commandments in the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet of the time of Kings David and Solomon is inscribed on a stone slab in New Mexico, which I've been at, and people can see pictures of at my website as well in great detail. So the Israelites were over here in great numbers before, as were Carthage. Was an Israelite colony, and they had a large settlement over here and a great deal of contact in the New World. The Greeks described North America very well as a Carthaginian colony. But in leading on to more in Ezekiel 38, I also want to point out that where it says here in verse 11 that the Gog-Magog alliance attacks a land of unwalled villages without walls, having neither bars nor gates, keep in mind Ezekiel was using ancient terminology. to describe a latter-day period. He didn't have high-tech words. But if you realize, for those of you who watched the Lord of the Rings movie that was popular around the world, in the Siege of Minas Tirith, it was very obvious how you needed strong walls and bars and gates to keep out a besieging enemy. A nation or city that neglected its walls and its bars and its gates was essentially a defenseless nation. These are euphemisms for a nation which has neglected its defense of its homeland. We really don't have much in the way of defending our homeland because we think the oceans on either side will protect us. Also, where it says they will dwell safely, all of them, in verse 11, the Hebrew word translated safely isn't always translated that way. It can also mean carelessly, and it's translated that way in Ezekiel 39:6. The same exact Hebrew word that's translated safely in 38 is translated carelessly in the King James. Careless implies complacent, that they're not really aware that they're under grave danger. Now, also down lower in Ezekiel 38 is an often overlooked verse, in verse 17, where it says, "Thus saith the Lord God, are you he," in other words, it's talking to Gog throughout this chapter, "are you he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring you against them," meaning against Israel. So this is telling us that as old as Ezekiel was, that prophecy dates about 2,500 years ago. This prophecy is telling us there's more than one prophet that's older than Ezekiel that has talked about that same exact event. One of them is in Joel 2, where Joel 2 was written perhaps 2 or 3 centuries before Ezekiel. But there it talks about events that will happen during the day of the Lord. So this clearly is talking about the latter days ahead of us, where it talks about the sun and moon being darkened and the stars withdraw their shining, and it shows divine intervention in a war in the latter days, just like Ezekiel 38 talks about a war in the latter days where God intervenes to save his people. And it shows there in Joel 2 that his people, in verse 17, are told to fast and weep and cry out to God and come rescue them and spare them from this invading army. And notice in verse 20, God does intervene, and then he says, "I will remove far off from you the northern army." So they're being attacked from the north, just like Ezekiel 38 says that the Israelites, the people of Israel in the latter days, will be attacked from out of the north. That's in verse 15 of Ezekiel 38. And notice also here in verse 20, it says, "I will drive him into a land barren and desolate, and his face toward the east sea, and his hind part toward the utmost sea." So the utmost direction from the east is, of course, the west. So this attack from the north is going to come down on the people of Israel, and it's going to fall particularly on a nation that has, call it the land from sea to shining sea, that is bordered by an east sea and a west sea. Describes their geography. That does not describe the modern Jewish state. They have an ocean on the west, but they don't have any body of water on the east. The Dead Sea is just a little salt lake. And but look at the nations of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh in the modern world. The United States is a land from sea to shining sea on the east and west, like it says in Joel 2, and also they're a land gathered out of many people, a melting pot nation, like it says in Ezekiel 38. Plus they have the name of Israel on them, and the name of Isaac, being a Saxon nation. Saxons just means Isaac's sons. And we have lost track of that in the modern world, but these are parallel chapters. And so it really also points to the United States, but we're Manasseh. It points to Ephraim, the brother Anglo-Saxon nations as well. The British Isles, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all have western and eastern oceans and seas, all along their borders, all along the east and west. So all of the Anglo-Saxon nations fit this description in Joel 2:20 as being nations that will be attacked from out of the north. And just consider geography. In the old Cold War, we knew that we would be attacked over the pole by Russia from out of the north. That was the common perception. And if you look at the Israelite nations in the modern world today, Russia, China, Iran, and their allies being the Gog-Magog alliance, Australia and New Zealand would certainly be attacked from out of the north by China and their allies that way. The Canada and the United States region would be attacked from out of the north, just as we always expected in the Cold War. And the British Isles would be attacked from out of the north, from the Russian main military bases that are in Murmansk, up in the Kola Peninsula.
Stephen, what about the Russians? Did any of the Israelites go to Russia?
Well, the Israelites lived in Russia, or the land of what we call Russia today, for many, many centuries. The Israelites, called the Sake, that later were called the Saxons by the Romans, they lived in the region of the Black Sea and were spread out all across the Russian steppes as far as east of the Caspian Sea, as my book makes plain. The Persians fought the Sake, Scythians east of the Caspian Sea. They were spread out so far because there were so many of them. And Parthia was their allied brother Saxon or Saka nation that had clear Israelite origins. And when Parthia fell in 227 A.D., all of the Israelite, Saxon, German, Goth, Jute, they had all those names upon them. They migrated in a tidal wave out of Asia into Europe from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century on, and eventually formed the population bases of the modern European nations, from which the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada were settled.
So who are the people in Russia who will be behind this attack? Who are they in terms of their ancient history?
Well, in terms of their ancient history, they're in Ezekiel 38, when it lists the Gog-Magog alliance, it lists the nations primarily from Japheth. Remember, Noah, when he started the human race over again, had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth has many of these nations. There's a few from Ham, but Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, all of these are descendants of Japheth. When it talks about Gomer and Togarmah, these are descendants of Japheth. Persia really is a Japheth term as well. If you remember, the Bible talks about the Medo-Persian Empire, or secular sources do too. That term Medes is from the Japheth term Madai, which in Genesis 10 is listed as the son of Japheth. Now, where our King James says Ethiopia and Libya, it really means Cush and Phut are the Hebrew terms that are translated Ethiopia and Libya. Ethiopia is a very small nation in Africa, and there are Cushites there, but the majority of the Cushites that will be in this alliance are in the region of Pakistan and Afghanistan, where the name of Cush is stamped on that region to this date. If you look on a globe, you'll see the Hindu Kush mountains straddle Afghanistan and Pakistan along the northern region. That was the absolute seat of Al-Qaeda, the training camps of Al-Qaeda, and that's the region where we're at war right now, even yet in Afghanistan. And Pakistan, is barely an ally in this particular war, but many of their elements are reportedly in the media allied with the Taliban.
Okay, now which nations are going to be in this alliance against the USA? Modern-day nations. What are we looking at?
Well, as they're identified in Ezekiel 38, Russia, China, Iran, where it says Togarmah of the North Quarters, he would be part of Russia or China. That could be Siberia, Manchuria, North Korea, Mongolia. The Persia nation is Iran. Gomer and all his bands, it says, and I think it was all his tribes in the version of the Bible you read, that's China. And it's an extremely numerous nation, and they're the ones that are Russia's strategic ally and also an ally of Iran that have stepped into that role. Even though we're involved in a war in Afghanistan, because Kush is identified as a nation that will be part of this alliance, the Hindu Kush mountains that are named where Kush lives in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think those nations will eventually slide into that orbit, and probably at some point the United States will have a fiscal crisis and have to withdraw its army out of that region, and Russia and China will move right into that vacuum very quickly.
Now, Stephen, how do you see this war actually unfolding and playing out?
That's a very good question, because the tactics of this are very easy to understand when you look how it could happen on a map. I urge people to get a round globe so they can see it very easily, because it says the nations will be attacked from out of the north. Now, if people remember their history, Alaska used to be a Russian colony. The Russians have all the maps and knowledge about Alaska. They sold it to the United States. I think it was in the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. But that is a former Russian territory, Alaska, but it's a United States state right now. It would be very easy when this attack takes place for the Russians and Chinese, and by the way, the Bible clearly shows this is going to be a surprise Pearl Harbor kind of an attack, but they could easily pull off this attack by having their Spetsnaz troops seize any number of Alaskan airfields very suddenly and start an immediate 24/7 airlift of Russian and Chinese troops from out of Siberia over to Alaska, which is just a very short flight. They could also use Chinese merchant fleet vessels to send reinforcements up to Alaska and use their substantial Chinese submarines and Russian submarines to prevent our aircraft carriers from getting up there to stop this overwhelming tide that'll flow from Asia into Alaska. And as soon as of course, they'll be bringing helicopters, warplanes, and they will send them down through the North American continent and attack us from the north, just like the Bible says.
Do you think it will?
Very easy to do.
Stephen, do you think it will start with a surprise nuclear attack from submarines on the east and west coast?
It could. There's another prophecy where it talks about ships attacking. This is in Numbers 24. It's an obscure latter-day prophecy where it talks about, this was done by Balaam, but he talks about the descendants of Eber and Asher being jointly attacked by ships in the latter days. Well, the descendants of Eber is the namesake of the Hebrews, or the Hebrews, and that includes all the nations of Israel, Judah. It includes the Arabs, the Ishmaelites. It includes all the sons of Abraham by Keturah and his concubines, as well as it says in Genesis 25. All of these people are descendants of Eber, and Asher is the forefather of the Assyrians. My first book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel, has that information in it. The most recent 4-book series does not. But the Assyrians were a Semitic people, descended from Shem, just like all the Israelites. So they were very, very much looking like the same people. And when Parthia was in its empire status in Asia, the Assyrians were an allied people of them. And when the Sasanian Persians of Japheth overthrew that empire of the Semites and drove them out of Asia, the Assyrians had to leave as well and were pushed up into Europe and identified them as living amongst the German people, a NATO ally. But it says that these nations will be attacked by ships. So it does allow for them to be attacked, and also Genesis 49 says the nations of Joseph, that's Ephraim and Manasseh's nations, will be attacked by archers who shoot missiles at him. And a missile, of course, is, in a modern term, we understand these as cruise missiles or ICBMs, but in the ancient term, an arrow was, of course, the long-range missile, and it would be shot from a launcher. Now, in Ezekiel 39, again, using Old Testament terms for low-tech terms to describe modern weaponry, in Ezekiel 39:3, it says when this attack takes place, God is going to make sure that some of Gog and Magog's weapons don't work. It says, I will smite your bow out of your left hand and will cause your arrows to fall out of your right hand. So the arrows or missiles, some of these will not work. But they could certainly be fired from not only submarines, but merchant ships that would have erector gantries that, as part of a surprise attack, wouldn't have shoes and cheap shirts. They'd have missiles and just lift them up out of their below decks and fire them at a particular time from the West Coast or wherever they were approaching. As maybe you have discussed this with your listeners, but there was a mysterious launch of what was apparently a missile off the coast of California not long ago.
Absolutely.
And very reliable military sources identify that as a missile.
We had retired General Cash on the program, who was a former deputy commander of NORAD, and he said without a doubt it was an ICBM.
Excellent. I quote I quote General Cash's statement in my website on a blog on that same missile launch. And I think what really happened was either the Russians or Chinese were giving us a warning that this attack could happen at any time, and they're showing us how really defenseless we are and vulnerable to this kind of an attack. See, now it says in Ezekiel 38 that this is mostly going to be a conventional attack because it says they want to come and take a spoil. They want our gold, our silver, our cattle, our goods, etc., and also they want our land. China would love to have our land to feed their populations. This
is what I think is going to happen, Stephen. This is my speculation. And you don't know this because we haven't had enough conversations privately about this, but the way I got on this radio program years ago was I was working at TBN for Paul Crouch, and I was the director of marketing of Trinity Broadcasting Network. And in a day in April 1998, I felt an impression, very strong impression, to go to the chapel and pray. I'm giving you the condensed story. Anyhow, while I was there, I had a vision, and I listen, I don't have visions every day. It was an unusual experience, but it was like a movie in front of me, and I saw burned out American cities. I saw cities on fire. I saw refugees. And as I began to tremble and shake and weep, I said, Lord, what am I seeing? And I didn't hear this audible. I heard this internally. I heard the words, this is your country's future. And I asked the Lord for a scripture to confirm what I was seeing was from him. He gave me a scripture out of Isaiah. I didn't tell anybody what I saw. I went home. I stayed quiet. The next day, my daughter, Carissa, who was 22 at the time, in the morning she said, Dad, the Lord spoke to me last night in my sleep. And I thought she meant she had a dream. She said, no, he spoke to me. He came up to me in my sleep and spoke to me. And he said, daughter, beginning tonight, I will speak to you about the end times through dreams and visions. And she said, Dad, he gave me a dream about the last days. And I saw our family huddled together, and we were surrounded by thousands of people, and they were rotating around us like on a carousel. And she said they were skeletons, and they were reaching out their bony arms towards you, Dad, and they were crying in a loud voice, if you knew this was going to happen, why didn't you tell us?
Well, that's a very important concept, that those who have an awareness of what's coming upon our nations and the dangers we face have to be watchmen.
Stephen, this is the only reason. I've been doing this for 12 years. There's no other reason. You'd have to be insane to do what I've done for 12 years, to take the abuse, the criticism, the hardships, and everything that we've done. The only reason I've done it is because of the fear of God, of what I saw that day in the TBN Chapel in April 1998, and the Lord telling me, this is your country's future. And the next day, my daughter saying, I saw skeletons reaching out to you, Dad, saying, if you knew this was going to happen, why didn't you tell us? That's why you're on this radio show right now, Stephen Collins, because I can't get away from what I saw 12 years ago.
Well, in fact, I'll share with you also, too, this was shown to me by Revelation 23 years ago. And I put through, I've been put through a great deal of abuse and criticism and unbelievable spiritual warfare attacks to keep me from getting this message out or the books getting out or this material. So it has been resisted by the enemy a great deal. But when you talk about cities burning, it shows clearly in Ezekiel 38 that the Gog-Magog alliance wants our physical assets, silver, gold, cattle, goods. Cattle are livestock that live on the pastures, the arable land. They don't want our people. It's very possible that nuclear weapons could be used on the cities because they don't care about it. That's not a physical asset they want.
That's right. I believe it will be neutron weapons that will kill the people, not destroy buildings. It would be biological, chemical. It will be a 3-layer attack on the East Coast and the West Coast. And this, going back to 1998, and when the Lord was speaking to me about this, and again, I don't hear audible voices. I hear an inner voice, and I said, Lord, what are you showing me? And he said, they will not attack the center of the country. And I said, why? And he said, they want your farms.
Exactly. That's just exactly what Ezekiel 38 says. And I also believe that this attack would begin with electromagnetic pulse weapons that would fry all of our electrical communications facilities, so the civilian population would basically be in the Stone Age. In our digital age, nothing would work. So you would hardly, if your listeners ever get to a time where nothing works, it's probably because this invasion has begun, and you better get ready for it from the north. And we are commanded by God to fight this invasion. It says in verse 21 of Ezekiel 38, I will call for a sword against Gog, him, throughout all of my mountains. And at some point, it also says every man's sword will be against his brother. Now, that doesn't mean the Israelites. That means this Gog-Magog nation will end up fighting. Their armies will start dividing and fighting each other when God intervenes. And so he will. There's an example in the Old Testament where he caused 3 nations to fight each other and wipe each other out.
So most likely they're going to be fighting over who gets control of certain parcels of the USA, and they're actually going to turn on themselves.
Exactly. But there's another layer to how this attack could turn out. On my website, or even you can just Google Chinese nanotechnology weapons, and my blogs are at the top of the Google universe. You can read my take on on the Chinese efforts to develop nanotechnology weapons, which is written about by many others as well, too. And my take on it is by developing nanotechnology weapons that blend the micro-miniaturization of nanobots, and you target them with a genome trigger, with the human genome, you could theoretically create nanobots that would target certain DNA hosts. In other words, you could create a bomb with either an airburst or in the water or in the food, which would target certain populations.
That's right.
For example, in America, they could target whites, blacks, Latinos.
Yes.
Frankly, they could develop a weapon which would target everyone who doesn't have Chinese DNA. And the Chinese would be immune to this attack if you had enough Oriental genes in you of the Chinese nature, and that would also wipe out their Russian and Iranian allies too.
Stephen, I want to ask Steve about Parthia, because this is an ancient empire I don't know anything about, and I'm going to be learning with you. There is a real hunger in the people to know the historical truth about the tribes of Israel, and you've really touched a nerve. And what I'm telling people, Steve, is, hey, even if you disagree with Steve's conclusions, the historical research alone is worth getting the books. I mean, if you just to learn historically about how Israel came about as a nation and where the tribes went and where they migrated over the years, just for that information alone, the books are worth it. And people can draw their own conclusions after reading the material. But I know this, Steve. Once they read the books, it'll mess up their theology. I mean, they're going to have to refigure a lot of things that they have been taught in mainstream churches, because things don't compute, do they?
No, they don't. In fact, we modern Christians have been spoon-fed in a concept that we have to be apologists for the Bible, and we have to take it on faith, or in spite of the fact that the Bible, they say, is not scientific. In fact, when you read my books, you will see that the Bible is very scientific, and it tracks perfectly with history and is very predictive in its prophecies to show that God is guiding world events throughout the past and up into our current times, and like we discussed in the last broadcast, what he'll be doing in the future. So Christians do not have to be apologetic about their faith in the Bible. In fact, we can have faith because of what has happened in history and the scientific record of the world history. And today's interview, I think, will be an interesting one, as the Parthian Empire is an ancient superpower, really the equal of Rome, according to the Roman Empire's own historians. And it used to be talked about a great deal over the centuries, and it was really only in the Darwinian period, like in the late 1880s and so forth, and up to our current age, when the evolutionists took over the educational system, that the empire of Parthia somehow just disappeared.
Now, Steve, if we had a map of the old Parthian Empire and we laid it over a modern map, what would we be looking at as far as the geography?
Okay, the Parthian Empire is sometimes covered in your encyclopedias within the context of the Persian Empire, because it was basically in the same region as Persia. Its borders fluctuated, but its main border on the west was the Euphrates River. That's into like Iraq and Syria in the modern world. On the east, it would be toward almost to the Indus River, which would be like in the border of modern Pakistan, and there were related Saka Parthian, Indo-Parthian kingdoms into India. The Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean would have been their southern border, and then the northern border, the Romans never got there, so it's a little bit undifferentiated, but it was up by the Caspian and Aral Sea, and their allies, the Scythians, that we talked about, their fellow tribes of Israel, were to the north of them in the South Russian steppes. But the Parthian Empire would basically be taking in the modern nations, all or some of the nations of Iran, Iraq, some of Turkey, some of Syria, up into Armenia in the Caucasus, also into Afghanistan, up into some of the stands in the Central Asian republics, and into Pakistan. So
okay, now, who
that's the area.
Okay, now who were the people who are responsible for starting this Parthian Empire?
Well, the Parthian Empire began around 250 BC, and it went through a period of rapid expansion under several rulers. And when it began as really an effort by the 10 tribes of Israel who had been taken captive earlier to reassert themselves into becoming an independent power. And the Parthian Empire fulfilled a specific biblical prophecy that all of your listeners can turn to in Isaiah 14:2. Isaiah was a prophet who prophesied to the kingdom of Israel just before it fell and went into exile. But in verse 2 of Isaiah 14, he prophesies that the Israelites eventually would take captive and rule over their oppressors who took them captive. And the nations that took them captive, that's all the tribes of Israel, including Judah, were Assyria, Babylon, and the Medo-Persians, as many Israelites were placed in the cities of the Medes, according to the Bible. So we would need to find, if God is true and the Bible is true, we need to find an Israelite empire that literally did fulfill that prophecy and rule over Assyria, Babylon, and the Medo-Persians. And the Parthian Empire fulfilled that prophecy. I make the case in my books that the Parthian Empire was mostly led by the tribe of Ephraim, which was the dominant tribe of the house of Joseph in the 10 tribes of Israel. Many of your readers have probably tried to read the Bible through, in a year, and when they get to certain sections of like Numbers 26, it's the begats, where it becomes very dry and dull, and people tend to just read over it. But those parts of the Bible are incredibly important to a researcher because it gives the clans and sub-tribal names of the Israelite tribes, and they can be traced in history. The Parthian Empire began really as a union of three separate units, the Bactrians, the Iranians, and the Dahanites, according to the secular historians. And when you look at Numbers 26:35, those are the names of the three of the clans of Ephraim, the Iranites, the Bactrites, and the Dahanites. And so here we have three Israelite names as the tribes that formed the backbone of the beginnings of the Parthian Empire. And some of their cities clearly had Israelite names. The name of Isaac was on one of their cities. It was called Asak. Another one was Samariana, which repeated the name of Samaria. The capital of the old kingdom of Israel was a Parthian city. Gaza, an old Philistine name from the Bible, was another name of one of the cities in Parthia. So the Israelite origins of the Parthians are very clear in their language, their culture, their looks. Their artwork shows that they were bearded Semites. These were not individuals from the interior of Asia. And I think one reason why the Parthian Empire has been pretty well deleted from the knowledge of the world is because if you scratch their surface very deeply at all, it would be quite obvious that they were an Israelite empire and that God had kept his promise in Hosea 1 that we talked about in our first program, that God was going to make the Israelites exceedingly numerous, far more numerous than they ever were in the old kingdom of Israel once he put them into exile.
Steve, why do you think that information is suppressed?
Well, I think in Revelation 12:9 it says in the latter days, which I think we and many of our listeners would agree, we're living in the latter days. The book of Revelation is one about the latter days, and it says in Revelation 12:9 that the enemy will have succeeded pretty well in deceiving the entire world. And one way to deceive the world is, of course, to convince people that God doesn't exist. Evolution fits that particular goal. But by suppressing the knowledge of the 10 tribes of Israel and suppressing their history, essentially writing them out of the textbooks and teaching everything from the Greco-Roman perspective, when in fact there were many other empires in the world besides the Greeks and the Romans, they have eliminated a major component of the Bible, which is fulfilled prophecy all through the entire time from when Israel and Judah first fell up to the modern times. If we could see the biblical prophecies about them have actually been fulfilled throughout the years and right up into ours, we could see that the living hand of God is guiding the affairs of nations, and the Bible is a very living, real book, and that we have a creator who's in charge of the modern geopolitical events. And, of course, evolution would collapse in any real contest with the Bible because it has not a leg to stand on, but the Bible's prophecies are true, and you can prove it.
Steve, why is it significant that we understand that Parthia was formed by Israelites? What's the historical and biblical significance of this information?
Well, the first is, as I mentioned, fulfilled prophecy, because in Isaiah 41, verses 21 to 26, God challenges all the readers of the Bible and all false gods, etc., to watch his ability to fulfill prophecies to prove that he is the creator and that there is no other so-called God or deity that can do that, that he's in charge of events clear into the millenniums down the future and will fulfill his prophecies. So seeing his ability to fulfill Isaiah 14:2, to fulfill the prophecy of Hosea 1:10, etc., in the Israelites' tribes throughout history proves that the Bible is real. And if we can see that our Creator is real, it would provoke more people to repentance and to obedience to him in these latter days, and realize there is a judgment coming where we have to be right with our Creator because he is all-powerful.
Are the Parthians known for any great achievements, anything in history that stands out about their existence?
Yes, they are. And in fact, one of them is on the cover of my book, Parthia, the Forgotten Ancient Superpower. It's a cutaway version of a Parthian electric battery. Most people don't realize there were electric batteries in the ancient world, and the Parthians had invented them.
They had electric batteries?
They had DC electric batteries. They're not alternating current, but direct current. And what they really did was there's a debate in some technical journals, which I quote in the in my book, whether they were used, because they were mass-produced. There was lots of them. Whether they used them for like a TENS unit for pain relief, given all the war injuries they had, or whether they used them for electroplating common objects into gold. And that's the view I have, is that they were using, they could connect these in series. And some of your listeners have probably seen documentaries on cable TV channels, because sometimes they're called the Baghdad batteries, or Eric von Daniken has also written about them. But these were Parthian batteries. It was not Persia or Babylon that invented them. It was the Parthian period.
What were they making them with?
They really looked like pottery, ceramic kinds of pottery vessels, but they had an inner core, with an acid-based solution that generated an electric current. And also, there's a more modern perspective that gives root to this, because it really is at the end of my book where it describes the fall of the Parthian Empire. But when they fell, they were overthrown by the Sasanian Persians, who drove all the Semitic people out of Asia and out of the Parthian Empire when it fell, and they drove them up into Armenia's direction, which was the only surviving Parthian province at that point, and they drove them up through the Caucasus, and they had to migrate into Europe to find new homelands. Parthia fell in the 3rd century A.D., and its people at that point were called, in Asia, they were called such names as the Sake, the Goths, the Germanii, the Kermans, the Jats, the Saccans. And when their peoples migrated up around the Black Sea into Europe and inundated the Roman Empire, they kept many of those same names, and were called Germans, Goth, Saxons, Jutes. The Vandals were a Gothic people. But these were the names of the Parthian people in the Parthian provinces. Another factor why biblical readers should be fascinated with Parthia is that Parthia was the source of the wise men and the Magi who brought the gifts to the Christ child. And Parthians were clearly had a connection to the ancient Jews and a Judeo connection where they were aware of the laws of God, because God was bringing these Magi to bring these gifts to the Christ child. And also in Acts 2, it says many Parthians were there in Acts 2 witnessing the events and were hearing the gift of tongues from the apostles in their own languages. In fact, it mentions other people who are also part of the Parthian Empire, where it talks about Elamites, people that were dwellers in Mesopotamia, etc. All of that was Parthian territory as well. And who else but the exiled 10 tribes of Israel would have a common bond to the God of Israel, except the Parthians? Oh, back one thing on the Parthian batteries. Mm-hmm. Remember in the medieval ages, because the Parthians' descendants migrated into Europe, where they formed the population bases for the nations we have today there. But remember the alchemists that were always trying to turn base metals into gold, mm-hmm. never successfully doing it?
Right.
But it was in the memory of those people that something like that had once been done, so they're continually trying. But it was Parthia that had actually done that, and that they were preserving the memories of what the Parthian priestly tribe, which was the Magi, that's where we get the word magic, is Magi, because they could do wonders and secret things that were concealed from the masses. They had hidden knowledge. Electricity was one of them. But you can imagine how the Parthian magi could have impressed the kings and nobles if they could bring them common pottery objects, and they could, in their secret laboratories, use their batteries to gold plate all of these objects and then bring them out and present them to the other people and say, see, we have turned this into gold, and we've done it, and this would give them incredible prestige and make them practically be seen as God's messengers on the earth. But really what they would be doing was just gold plating a common object so it looked like it was solid gold, but it wasn't. But the medieval alchemists were trying to replicate that feat and never were able to do it because they didn't have electricity. That was the key element that was missing.
Stephen, in our popular culture today, people refer to the lost tribes of Israel, the missing tribes of Israel. But are they really lost or missing, or are they simply reconfigured with a different name?
Well, it's really a myth that they were ever really lost, because their locations were known for a very long time throughout the Bible. In Daniel 7, when he's praying about the sins of Judah and Israel meaning the 10 tribes, he talks about the Israelites, and he says those that are near and those that are scattered far off in the nations where you've driven them. So he knew they had been widely scattered all over the world in many different places. Also, the book of James, if your listeners will look at that, the introduction to the book of James says that it's addressed to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. These tribes had addresses. And also in the 1st century A.D., the very prominent Jewish writer Josephus wrote about the 10 tribes, and he said they weren't lost at all. He says that the 10 tribes at that point were so numerous you couldn't even estimate their numbers. And he also said that their western border was the river Euphrates. And this is very key. He says the Israelites were located beyond Euphrates. And at the time he wrote that, the Euphrates River was long the recognized border between the Parthian and Roman empires. So Josephus, writing from within the perspective of the Roman Empire, when he said the Israelites, the 10 tribes, were beyond Euphrates, that was like a euphemism for saying in Parthia. And in a modern context, we can easily understand this, because if we were all in Texas and we were saying, well, this weekend we're going to go across the Rio Grande, we would understand that as a euphemism for meaning we're going to Mexico. In Josephus's time, his readers would have all understood that the phrase beyond Euphrates meant in the Parthian Empire. And so as of the 1st century A.D., the 10 tribes of Israel weren't lost at all. Both the writers of the Bible and the Jewish historians like Josephus knew exactly where they were. And as time went on, their awareness was still up into the Middle Ages as to where they were. As I quote in my books, there were several Jewish and medieval court writers. Ortelius was one to the Spanish kings, who wrote a great deal about the 10 tribes of Israel as they migrated up to the Black Sea and became called the Goths, the ones that lived up there. But the Goths were separate from the Parthians, and the Scythians were really the same people as the Goths, but the Scythian Sake name that we discussed in the first program was the Greek name for them. The Gothi, or the Goths, later was the Roman name for them.
Now, Steve, I'm going to read from Hosea chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. What is that scripture referring to?
Well, I think it addresses more than one time context. Mm-hmm. In Hosea 1:10, it says the number of the children of Israel are going to be, as you said, vastly numbered like the sand of the sea, where you can't even number them. Josephus's comment saying that they could not be estimated for their numbers really is a fulfillment of Hosea 1:10's prophecy right at that time. And those who have read my book, Israel's Tribes Today, can see which modern large nations have descended from the tribes of Israel to see that God has always kept that promise and has done today. Now, when you go further into verse 11, where it talks about the children of Judah and the children of Israel being gathered together and appoint themselves one head, there we go into a much more modern and really millennial context, because Ezekiel 37 has a prophecy called the two sticks prophecy, where it mentions that Israel and Judah will finally be united together under one head when the millennium comes and when King David is resurrected to be a king over them, all the tribes again. But of course King David will report and be subordinate to Jesus Christ, who will be ruling over all the nations of the earth. But David, it says in Ezekiel 37, will be that one head who rules over the children of Israel and Judah when they're reunited. And where it talks about them coming back to the land, there's hints of that in there. They shall come up out of the land. This really looks to the millennial prophecies, because in the later chapters, toward the end of the book of Ezekiel, it talks about the Gog-Magog war in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which we discussed last time. But the rest of the chapters of Ezekiel are millennial chapters on how the millennium is going to unfold. Obviously, it doesn't call it the millennium in Ezekiel, but the reign of the Lord, or when God rules the earth. And it says there that each of the tribes of Israel will have at least a contingent of their people that is returned to the promised land and has a new territory there, as they were in the old days of kings of Israel and Judah, because each of the tribes of Israel will have some people return to that promised land. Currently, that has not been fulfilled. I don't expect to see that part of Ezekiel's prophecy for the millennium fulfilled in our time, because Zephaniah 2 prophesies that it is the tribe of Judah which will inhabit the old promised land in the seacoast area, lie down in the city of Ashkelon. Zechariah 12 and 14 associates Judah as being connected to the city of Jerusalem in the latter days, and it doesn't mention any of the other tribes other than Judah being in that particular region, and that's where the Jews are. The Israelis are the tribe of Judah, and they have fulfilled that prophecy about where they would have a nation in the latter days, exactly where the Bible said they would have it.
So for all the Christians who, whether they call themselves Christian Zionists or whatever, and they're very, very excited and very supportive of modern-day Israel in the Middle East, it's important for them to understand that what is taking place in the Middle East is that the tribe of Judah, the Jews, have returned to the land that God said that they would have, but this does not include all of the Israelites.
No, not at all. In fact, the Jews that are the Israelis that are there now in the old promised land are just a tiny slice of the tribes of Israel, a very small slice. And the rest of the Israelites are scattered abroad. And indeed, it was prophesied in Genesis that Abraham would be the father of many nations. And it says his seed would scatter to the east, the west, the north, and the south. So they were never intended to be in one spot throughout our age. They were going to be scattered widely around the world into new nations.
But you believe it is biblical that the Jews would return to Jerusalem at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. Judah and Jerusalem are mentioned almost synonymously in the prophecies of Zechariah 12 and 14. Zechariah 14 specifically states that the Messiah will come at a time when Judah, the Jews, are fighting a war, defending Jerusalem, and the city is half taken, etc. And it says Judah shall fight in that war. And he rescues the tents of Judah first, because they're in the greatest danger. They have no hinterland in their small Israeli nation. The much, much larger nations of the house of Israel, the United States, Canada, Australia, the nations of Western Europe, Scandinavia, have much bigger hinterlands. And so I definitely believe that the Israelis, the Jews, the tribe of Judah, has every divine right to be right where they are in the promised land at this time, because Bible prophecy has declared it.
All right. I've got a mountain of emails. I probably should go through some of these in this interview. A lot of people who have written to me and asked me to explain some of the things that you're talking about, and that's easier said than done. As you know what it's like to try to answer hundreds of emails coming in. And on the subject of Ezekiel 38 and the war, one person wanted to know, are you teaching that is Armageddon?
In terms of its relationship to the Revelation battle, yes. The
war that is fought in Ezekiel 38, Are you saying that that is the Battle of Armageddon?
Yes, but it's not called that, of course, because it's using different terms, different prophet from centuries previous.
So you think that's the final war?
It has to be. Ezekiel 38 and 39 discuss a war in the latter days. A great invasion takes place of the nations of Israel, and then God himself intervenes in the latter part of Ezekiel 38 and 39 and sets up his rule on the earth. Revelation has the same perspective in Armageddon, that it's a great world war occurring at the end of the age. God intervenes and sets up his kingdom at the end of this age and going into the millennium. And there's some very strong parallels between Ezekiel 38, 39 and the Battle of Armageddon. For example, that's really off topic for Parthia, but if you look in Ezekiel 39, it says at one point that you reach the point where it says, "It is done." And when you look in Revelation for the Battle of Armageddon, it also says, "It is done." Another commonality is in Ezekiel 38 and 39, when the great invading hosts are slain, God gives their carcasses to the birds and the animals of the earth. He says, "Come eat their flesh." In Revelation 19 also, it says when at the very end battle, when the nations resist Jesus Christ and his returning heavenly armies, they're slaughtered, and God invites the birds and animals of the world to eat the carcasses of the fallen slain. So there's tremendous commonalities between the two. They have the same time context, some of the same events, same outcome.
But in Ezekiel 38, it says that there's a time period where they're burying the dead and cleaning up from the battle.
Yes, well, that's actually in Ezekiel 39 after the war's over.
Yes, uh-huh.
Yeah, it says that there will be so many dead bodies that they have to find the bones. You know, God invites the birds and animals to eat the flesh, but that still leaves the bones all over the place. And God says there that people will have full-time employment doing nothing but just gathering the bones and burying them from so many dead that will be slain in this particular and very end of the age world war.
Well, if that's the final war, why are they cleaning up the carcasses?
Well, they're cleaning up the bones to bury them, to clean up just simply to bury the bones at the end of the age. And it makes sense that you clean up the damage and the debris from a war in order to start the millennium. And so I really don't see any problem with that. Just burying the dead is a common ritual after any war.
Watching the events that are taking place with China in recent weeks, China's becoming more brazen, more daring, and it's they're strutting on the world stage now.
Yes, they are.
What do you see developing that is in fulfillment of prophecy with this rise of China?
Well, certainly the rise of China is tied to that of Russia and Iran because they're all allies together, mutually supporting each other against the United States and the West. Russia is China's strategic ally, and China is pretty open. If you look at some of their comments of the generals of China that have been reported in the press, they're preparing to win and fight a war against the United States, and they're proceeding with great haste to build a super modern military. They're building and almost become operational. One United States admiral said that it was reaching operational status, their missile that would be fired at U.S. aircraft carriers to take them out at the beginning of war. It's a ballistic missile. They have supersonic cruise missiles, which can be launched at our aircraft carriers. They have a number of weapon systems, and they've really put their efforts into submarines and not into aircraft carriers. I think China has really made the decision that aircraft carriers are just gigantic sitting duck targets, and they're putting more effort into how to sink them rather than to build them. China has huge reserves financially where they could build aircraft carriers, and they're very, very slowly building one. But that's an old Russian converted one, but no one's in a hurry to get that thing built in China. But China also made the President Hu Jintao, just before he came to Washington, one of his comments was that the U.S. dollar, I don't have it in front of me, but was a part of the past. That was one of the headlines on a Fox News story. And it's no secret that China and many other nations are disgusted with the debauchery of the U.S. dollar, the federal deficits over here, etc. And China, as the owner of so many treasury bonds, is one of the United States' biggest creditors. They have every reason to be concerned about the value of their investment.
Yes, and as you and I have discussed, my son Jeremy, when he was in China, he saw ancient tablets that were written in Hebrew, which clearly shows that the Israelites had traveled into what is now modern-day China.
Well, in fact, I cite books in my particular book. These are secular books that show the extent to which the Israelites, the people of Isaac, the Scythia or the Scythians, had spread clear off into Eastern Asia, and were in fact there's one indication that the Great Wall of China, one that was built. One of the reasons was to keep out the Israelites. At that point, they were expanding and pushing that way before they got pushed back into Parthia. The Israelites had expanded far into western China. They were pushed back into Parthia by the Huns and the other nations up there, where they reinforced Parthia for its wars against Rome. But if I might mention it, when Rome and Parthia, because it has a Chinese connection here, when Rome and Parthia first came into conflict, Crassus was the Roman general that invaded Parthia, confident of victory. Crassus was the general that defeated Spartacus in the slave revolt. For those of listeners who have seen the movie Spartacus, either the older one or new one, well, Crassus invaded Parthia with 40,000 Roman soldiers. To make the story short, Parthia didn't even bother to send the infantry because Rome had so underestimated them. They just sent their cavalry and destroyed the Roman army. They killed Crassus. Half the army was killed. A fourth of it scattered back. And the Parthians took 1/4 of the Roman army into captivity. And they placed them in a city way off in the northeast of the Parthian Empire, which is up by western China. And there have actually been books written about a city that was found in western China that had Roman artifacts, had Roman structure built into it, where it looks like they found that Roman garrison, because the Parthians treated them well. They didn't make slaves out of them. They just made them Parthian citizens, gave them Parthian wives, and said, we'll put you on the far end of our empire, but you guard that corner. And Parthia was well known to the people of India and China, who wrote about it as well. There's one episode where when China's ambassador to Parthia was being brought over to the Parthian capital, the Parthians met him at the border between China and Parthia. To bring him to Parthia's capital, they sent 20,000 heavily armored knights. And the Parthian cavalry really were knights, just like in the medieval context in Europe. They even had jousting, where they had armored horses, and they had armored riders, as knights that were mounted in armor. And and they had the feudal system of government. They had a central king, but then you had vassal kings and lords, etc., that would be mustered to war to support the central king in a time of war. But other than that, they ruled their own fiefdoms. And so there was many similarities between the feudal system of Parthia and the later feudal system that emerged in Europe when their descendants got there. But one thing that's going to be a very great surprise to the readers of this book is that the Parthian Empire really has many governmental foundations that were echoed in the parliamentary and form of government that emerged in Europe and the later forms, because the Parthians did not automatically have different dynasties competing. Their dynasty was always one dynasty that was blood relatives, and that was, as you'll see in my book, the seed of David, because God had promised David that his seed would rule over the house of Israel in perpetuity, and the Parthians always had one of those seeds of the house of Israel ruling over them. But the Parthians had a bicameral legislature, if we can call that. One historian, George Rawlinson, calls the two houses the royal house and the Senate. The royal house was all the male relatives of the kings, any one of which could be elected king. But this is another secret, is that the Parthian Empire elected their emperors. They elected their kings. And it had to come with a concurrent vote of the Senate and the royal house. Both had to agree on the same candidate. But the Senate was composed of the nobility and priests of the Parthian Empire, and they were called the Magi and the Wise Men. These were Parthian senators that were coming to visit the Christ child, the men from the east, the wise men from the east that Matthew 2 refers to. That's not a generic term. The wise men was literally their title as Parthian senators. And Herod had to treat them with tremendous deference. because when men of such high rank came, they were escorted by each one up to 1,000 Parthian armored knights. It says in Matthew 2 that the whole city of Jerusalem was afraid when the three wise men came. And, of course, three people arriving in Jerusalem wouldn't have been noticed. But the fact that they were Parthian soldiers escorting them was what scared the whole city, because just a few decades before their arrival, Parthia and Rome had a war where Parthia had fought the Roman armies in Judea, in that region of Palestine, and they had kicked them out. And Parthia had installed a ruler that replaced King Herod, and the Romans had to counterattack a few years later and move the Parthians back across on their side of the Euphrates River.
All right, so the wise men, the Magi who showed up at the birth of Christ, were not just, some people think they were three astrologers, riding camels, looking at a big star in the sky.
Yes.
What you're saying is that this was a diplomatic delegation.
Yes, it was. And in fact, they were quickly ushered into Herod like a diplomatic delegation should have been. And when Herod had received them, he was probably relieved to hear they were looking for a child who was born king of the Jews. So in other words, they were looking for someone who was born of the royal line of King David, which was the royal line of Judah.
And this would explain why they were looking for the king of the Jews.
Yes, and another reason why they were looking for someone of that bloodline was because, remember, David's seed had a curse that the sword would never depart from them. And Parthia periodically, although it had good rule over the nations that ruled over it, the royal house of King David that was ruling Parthia would sometimes kill each other off to eliminate the rivals, because any one of them could be king. And at the time that Christ was born, Parthia was ruled by a particularly evil individual who had killed off every male relative he could find. And so the Magi and wise men were actually looking to find living relatives who would be eligible for the throne of Parthia. And they had to go. They knew that their royal line had originated in the area of Judea, so they were arriving in that area looking for someone born of the royal house of Judah. And they were delighted when they found Christ. Joseph and Mary were each descended from David, and so Jesus Christ was a full-blooded descendant of David, which this really opens up a huge can of worms historically, because as a descendant of King David, the young Jesus Christ was eligible for the throne of Parthia, to be the emperor of Parthia later when he came to maturity. And remember, when the devil tempted him during those 40 days of testing, he said, "All these kingdoms will I give to you if you will fall down and worship me." Well, that actually was very possible, because if Christ had yielded to that temptation, he could have easily been the king of kings of Parthia and would have been ruling over that area to defeat the Romans.
And the Magi had expensive gifts to present.
Extremely. We have this kind of Christmas card concept that they had a little vial of frankincense, a little vial of myrrh, and a few gold coins. No, what they had was a treasure train of gold, frankincense, and myrrh and gifts that they had brought. And I think there was 10 or 12 of them, one for each of the 10 tribes of Israel, or 12 if you include Judah and Benjamin, and really 13 if you include Levi, because many, many Jews did not come back to Judea under Ezra and Nehemiah. Most of them stayed in the region of Persia, which later was ruled by Parthia.
And today, Stephen, there are hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Iran to this very day.
In Iran?
In Iran, yes.
Yes, well, historically, Judah was the only tribe of Israel that really was exalted in the old Persian empires, but Esther, Mordecai, Nehemiah, Ezra, these were all Jews. However, the current rulers of Iran, of course, are very anti-Jewish toward the Israelis, and
well, they would say that they're anti-Zionist, but they're not anti-Jewish. They would say, no, the Jews get along fine with us here in Iran. We don't like Zionists. I'm giving you what they would say.
And there is some truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing about the Iranian rulers that now are there is, in their Islamic mindset, they regard all previous non-Islamic civilizations of Persia to be impure, and so they are systematically destroying the relics and artifacts and ruins not only of the Parthians, but of the Achaemenid Persian rulers. That would be like Cyrus, Xerxes, and so forth.
So, Steve, last question. In the end, what did end the Parthian Empire? What was their downfall?
they fought so many wars against the Roman Empire. They had fought a gigantic world war in 217 AD against the Romans, and they had defeated the Roman Empire. But they had so depleted their strength that the Persians were able to revolt against them in about 227 AD and defeat them because their manpower had simply been depleted because their army had been worn out by continuous warfare. And if I might mention to your listeners, too, my website is www.stephenmcollins.com, where you can find a free sample of the text of my book on Parthia. They're posted in the book section. All of my books have a free text section available to them, and you can order them by following the links. And I probably should mention also as well that my website is donor supported. It's only on the internet because of the support of donors, and then I also subsidize the website with my income from a disability retirement. So if anybody is so inclined, I certainly would appreciate donations to keep the website on the internet and continue the research into other topics.
That's right. There's a lot there. It's Stephen, S-T-E-V-E-N, Stephen M. Collins, C-O-L-L-I-N-S, StephenMCollins.com. And the books, all 4 books are available. The Origins and Empire of Ancient Israel, Israel's Lost Empires, Parthia, the Forgotten Ancient Empire, and Israel's Tribes Today. Again, these 4 books are immensely rich with historical research. And as I said in the beginning, even if you don't agree with Steve's conclusions, and the research alone is worth the money to obtain these books and the time that you'll spend reading it, you will get quite an education from these books. I learn something every time I talk to Steve. He's a walking encyclopedia about ancient Israel. Steve Collins, thank you. Appreciate you coming on. We'll have you back. Okay?
Thanks a lot. I'll look forward to it.
All right.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ, you're listening to True News, the end-time newscast.